I still see the look in her eyes every time I close mine. Wild, unhinged, and utterly unapologetic. That evening, while I was making dinner and my son, Jonah, was upstairs resting, Karen let herself into my home and made a beeline for the kitchen sink. She was muttering something about rules, about how we can't have sick kids stinking up the place. And then she took the vials of insulin I had ordered from the pharmacy just hours before and, without hesitation, poured them straight down the drain. I was too stunned to move at first. It felt as if the world had tilted off its axis, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Finally, the reality of what was happening crashed in like a thunderstorm. She was destroying Jonah's life-saving medication. Insulin that not only kept him alive, but which also cost me hundreds of dollars every month and required precise refrigeration and dosage. And now it was cascading into the garbage disposal as if it was nothing more than leftover coffee. I dashed to stop her, but it was already too late. The last vial slipped from her trembling fingers and gurgled away. It took the entire strength of my will not to push her into the counter right then and there. Rage made me shake, but so did fear. Jonah, what if I hadn't heard the back door open? What if I'd been out running errands? By the time I could have gotten more insulin, who knows what might have happened to him? For a long moment, Karen and I just stood there, eye to eye, in a silence filled with more menace than words. She looked triumphant, as if she'd just carried out some holy mission. My heart was pounding in my ears, and the gravity of what she'd done finally sank in. This wasn't just property damage. This was attempted murder. And she looked almost proud. I'd encountered Karen in various states of self-righteousness before. She was, after all, the newly elected president of our homeowners association, determined to turn our once friendly neighborhood into her personal fiefdom. When the old HOA president stepped down, Karen had run uncontested, forcing her own brand of petty tyranny upon us. First, it was the demanding letters about how the color of our shutters clashed with the community aesthetic. Next, she wanted to fine us for leaving our garden hose improperly coiled, an act she deemed a tarnish on the neighborhood's curb appeal. But I never dreamed she'd stoop to this. Sure, she'd been prying into my life, gossiping about Jonah's illness, and complaining about every little noise or perceived violation. She made disapproving comments whenever Jonah's medical supplies got delivered. She once demanded to see inside the cooler, suspicious we might be storing contraband. She always acted as if she had some official authority, but I'd laugh it off, telling myself she was just playing HOA police. That evening, it wasn't funny anymore. As soon as Karen finally walked out, slamming my own door in my face, as though she owned it, I ran up to check on Jonah. His pallor told me everything. Even if he said he felt fine in that moment, his body needed a steady supply of insulin. I grabbed my phone, called 911, and explained that we had an emergency. It wasn't just about the missing vials. I needed immediate help in case Jonah's level shot out of range, and I also needed the police because a crime had just been committed. They arrived in minutes. An officer came in, took one look at the swirling mess in the sink, and scribbled notes in a little pad. The paramedics hovered over Jonah, confirming what I already knew. He'd be okay if he got insulin fast. We had a backup EpiPen-like device for emergencies, but that was only for the direst situations, and it wasn't going to last. The real problem was the cost and availability of new insulin vials. Even more pressing was the question, how could we prevent Karen from doing something like this again? The officer was calm, but he didn't look surprised by Karen's behavior. Apparently, her shenanigans within the neighborhood had escalated in recent weeks, and they'd had a few run-ins with her. But nothing quite like this. Pouring out someone's life-saving medication? That was unheard of. He turned to me, expression grave. We'll file the paperwork. She'll likely be brought in for questioning. Do you want to press charges? Absolutely, I breathed. I'm going to press charges for attempted murder. The words tasted bitter on my tongue, but I meant every syllable. There was no question in my mind. Karen could have cost Jonah his life. She tried to kill my child, no matter how indirectly, because she believed his medical needs offended some obscure HOA standard or sense of cleanliness. That was the moment everything changed. I'd always been averse to confrontation, preferring the quiet path of least resistance. But now, with my son's life threatened, I was ready to go to war. The fallout from that evening came faster than I expected. Within 24 hours, Karen was taken into custody for questioning. The police had recommended an attempted murder charge, though I was warned that when these cases go through the system, charges might be reduced or altered depending on the district attorney's decision. Karen, being Karen, posted bail almost immediately and was back on our street the next day, though this time with a criminal charge hanging over her head like a storm cloud. My priority was Jonah. That night, I called the pharmacy in a panic, begging them to expedite a new set of vials. Luckily, Jonah's doctor intervened and wrote an emergency order. We were able to get replacements within hours, though at a higher cost. I sat by Jonah's bedside as he stared at me with sleepy eyes and pumping stabilizing fluids into him. I couldn't shake the memory of Karen's eyes as she emptied those vials. Jonah deserved safety, not some unpredictable neighbor harboring a vendetta. Word spread through the neighborhood at breakneck speed. It seemed I wasn't alone in my grievances against Karen. A few neighbors reached out privately to offer support or share their own horror stories. One person recalled how Karen threatened to cut down their rose bushes if they didn't trim them according to her monthly schedule. Another described how Karen had started patrolling driveways with a measuring tape to ensure everyone's trash bins were aligned precisely 2 inches from the curb. Rumors circulated that she had snapped pictures of children playing in yards, sending outraged emails claiming they were trespassing on community property. But none of those stories compare to what she'd done to Jonah. Her brand of control had escalated to a horrifying level. Of course, Karen had her own clique, neighbors who admired her dedication to uniformity or considered her strong leadership a boon to property values. They whispered that maybe I was to blame or that I'd overreacted. But it was hard to spin a story that justified destroying a child's insulin in plain sight. Even so, as the days passed, I felt an undercurrent of fear in the community. HOAs can be complicated beasts. Some folks rely on them to keep property values high. Some see them as a necessary evil, and others just want to remain invisible. People worried that a scandal like this would tarnish the neighborhood's reputation, possibly leading to declining home prices. A surprising number of residents, those who'd moved here for the pristine aesthetics and the promise of safety, prefer to keep everything hush-hush, not wanting the press or any outside attention. Too late for that. A local reporter got wind of the story and tried to get a statement from me. I was too exhausted and emotionally drained to offer much. My only focus was Jonah's recovery. But the newspaper article was scathing. It painted Karen as the deranged HOA leader from every suburbanite's nightmare. She was, in their words, the ultimate cautionary tale of unchecked neighborhood power. I thought for sure that Karen would lay low for a while, maybe hide out and let a lawyer do the talking. Not Karen. She marched across the street to my driveway the following afternoon while I was unloading groceries. I saw her first, a determined silhouette stomping up my walkway. My heart hammered. I rushed to the door, worried Jonah might answer. But before I could speak, she started ranting. "This is all a misunderstanding," she hissed, in a voice loud enough for my neighbors to hear through their windows. "I only disposed of that insulin because your house fails to meet the sanitary requirements of our HOA bylaws. I was fulfilling my responsibility. It's not attempted murder. It's housekeeping." I stared in disbelief, momentarily speechless. Karen, with her arms crossed, looked dead serious. I realized with dawning horror that she truly believed her own twisted narrative. She thought she was right, as though the HOA gave her some godlike authority over the health decisions of an entire household. "Get off my property," I managed, teeth clenched so hard I was sure they'd crack. Karen squinted at me as if I were a bug under a microscope. "You can't tell me to leave. We have rules in this community, and you've been breaking them from day one. I don't care how sick your son is." That was enough. I marched to the phone and threatened to call the police if she didn't back away. She stood there a moment longer, face twitching, before turning on her heel and striding off like the queen of the block. It was that confrontation that sealed the resolve of many of my neighbors. Some of the quieter ones who'd stayed neutral approached me the next day. They were disturbed that Karen was so blatant. A small group decided to start a petition to recall her from the HOA presidency. Another group was looking into potential lawsuits. Most important to me, though, was the upcoming hearing, where a judge would review the evidence in the criminal case. If we were lucky, Karen wouldn't be able to weasel her way out of it this time. That same week, the district attorney officially charged her with attempted murder and destruction of vital property, a specialized state charge that recognized the severity of tampering with medical supplies. The news brought a faint smile to my lips, but the dread remained. I knew how manipulative people like Karen could be. She might claim mental instability or spin some elaborate defense story. Still, it was a start, and although I was bracing for a long battle, I couldn't ignore the flicker of relief inside me. She was going to face justice. At least, I hope so, to DY to go to war. I wish I could say things got better once the charges were filed, but the truth is, life felt more chaotic than ever. We were suddenly living under a microscope. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers from the next town started whispering about that insane HOA fiasco. Some seemed genuinely sympathetic, while others acted like spectators at a circus, expecting a meltdown to amuse them. Meanwhile, Jonah was stuck in a swirl of emotional ups and downs. 13 is a sensitive age, especially for a kid coping with type 1 diabetes. He'd always done a commendable job self-monitoring his glucose levels, balancing food choices, and using his insulin pump. But now he was anxious. He worried that someone might barge into our home again or tamper with his supplies. He had nightmares of people tearing out his infusion sites and discarding them like trash. I tried to be strong, to show him I was in control and that justice would prevail, but inside, I was a wreck. At night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the scene of Karen in my sink in slow motion, like a grainy film reel stuck on loop. Sometimes, the memory flared into a rage so intense, I found myself pacing the hallway, fists clenched, urging myself not to do anything reckless. The trial date was set 2 months from the incident, and every day leading up to it seemed to drag. Karen continued her usual tactics. She filed her own set of complaints within the HOA, all aimed at me and my failure to maintain sanitary conditions for the community. She even tried to get me evicted from the neighborhood, an absurd move, given I was a homeowner. But that didn't stop her from flooding the board's inbox with allegations that I was storing hazardous biological materials. In other words, Jonah's insulin. Unbelievably, a few of Karen's loyalists on the board tried to take her side. They argued that insulin vials should be properly contained in a separate facility, or that a child with diabetes posed some liability risk to the neighborhood. Their reasoning sounded like they'd spent too long reading misguided HOA blog posts, searching for ways to weaponize the bylaws. However, an even larger faction of neighbors, ones who'd quietly been enduring Karen's tyranny, rose up. They told her to back off, reminded her that she was under criminal indictment, and moved to oust her from her position as HOA president pending the outcome of the case. The board was deadlocked for a while, but eventually, with enough signatures on a community-wide petition, Karen was suspended. She refused to step down entirely, of course. In her mind, she was still the rightful ruler of our subdivision. In the weeks that followed, I started meeting with the district attorney's office to go over my testimony. They explained how attempted murder charges can be tricky. They had to prove not just that Karen destroyed the insulin, but that she did so with the intent or knowledge that it could kill Jonah. As insane as it sounded, Karen's defense might argue that she believed we could easily replace the medication, or that she was never truly aware that her actions could be lethal. The DA, a sharp-minded woman named Laura, listened patiently as I recounted every detail of Karen's behavior leading up to the incident. Her hostility, her demands, her repeated mention that Jonah's medication was unsanitary. Laura seemed confident we had enough evidence to show Karen's malicious intent, that in her pursuit of order, she'd gone to an extreme that, reasonably, would result in the child's potential death. You'd be surprised how often people think they can wiggle out of these charges by claiming ignorance, Laura said, her expression hardening. We're going to make sure Karen can't hide behind that excuse. Jonah was set to testify too, albeit briefly. Just hearing that made me feel a protective surge. I didn't want him to have to face Karen in court, to relive the trauma. But Jonah insisted. He said he wanted the judge and jury to see who this was really about, a real kid, not just a theoretical victim. Amid all the legalities, daily life had to continue. Jonah still had school. I still had my job. But everything was colored by the impending trial. Teachers quietly gave Jonah extra time on assignments. My manager at work allowed me flexible hours so I could handle court appearances and keep up with the chaos at home. Still, the tension in the air was constant. Sometimes I wondered how Karen was coping. Did she truly believe her own twisted logic, or was she pretending she had some moral high ground? Whenever I saw her from a distance, strolling around the neighborhood with her head held high, I felt a chill. The woman exuded confidence, as though she were invincible. Late one evening, I woke to the sound of my doorbell. I glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. My heart hammered as I fumbled down the stairs. Through the peephole, I saw no one, but taped to the door was a single envelope. Inside, I found a grainy photograph of Jonah. It looked like it had been taken from a car window while he was walking home from the bus stop. No note, just the picture. Karen? I couldn't prove it, but I was sure of it. My blood went cold. This wasn't just a paranoid neighbor trying to clean up the community. This was harassment, and it was escalating. I turned the envelope over to the police first thing in the morning. They told me they'd do what they could, but with no direct proof it was Karen. The best they could offer was a promise to keep an eye on the area. Jonah tried to brush it off, mustering a brave face. Mom, don't let her scare us. But I could see the fear in his eyes. It was too late. We were both on high alert, waiting for the next bomb to drop, for the next move in Karen's twisted game. The first day of the trial arrived with a crisp fall breeze that did nothing to cool my nerves. I remember standing outside the courthouse, my palms sweating despite the chill in the air. Jonah clutched my hand. He was trembling too, but he wore a determined expression that made me proud. The courtroom was bigger than I expected, with tall windows that let in beams of morning light. Karen sat at the defense table in a smart blazer, her hair slicked back, exuding an air of indignation. Her lawyer, a well-known defense attorney, was whispering in her ear. When Karen noticed us enter, she shot me a glare so venomous it felt like a physical strike. I squeezed Jonah's hand, trying to focus on the idea that we were here for justice, not for petty revenge. Opening statements set the stage. The district attorney, Laura, laid out the facts. Karen forcibly entered our home, dumped out prescription medication vital for the survival of a 13-year-old child, and did so with full knowledge that this could result in fatal consequences. Karen's defense attorney spun a different tale. He argued that Karen acted out of concern for improperly stored chemicals, an alleged violation of the HOA guidelines. He claimed her intentions were misguided, but not murderous, portraying her as an overzealous neighbor who never intended real harm. I felt my stomach churn at the word misguided. There's a big difference between a neighbor who's a stickler for rules and someone who deliberately destroys insulin vials. But defense attorneys excel at casting doubt. If they could get just one juror to see Karen's actions as a mere mistake, she might walk free or face only minor charges. When I took the stand, my hands shook, but I spoke as clearly as I could. I described the events of that terrible evening. Her barging in, the words she spat out, the frenzied look on her face. I could barely suppress my anger when I recalled the moment the last vial of insulin vanished down the drain. Karen's lawyer tried to trip me up, insinuating I'd over-dramatize the confrontation or that I could have easily replaced the medication. I answered calmly, explaining the costs, the critical timeline, and the difficulty of obtaining insulin at a moment's notice. Jonah testified next. My heart clenched as he walked to the witness stand, shoulders back, tried to appear braver than he felt. In a soft voice, he told the court what it's like to live with diabetes, how missing even one dose of insulin can lead to dangerously high blood sugar, eventually causing diabetic ketoacidosis. He explained that without insulin, he might slip into a coma or worse. Watching him speak, I saw some of the jurors shift in their seats. Some of them had children or grandchildren, presumably. Seeing my son, A real person with real vulnerabilities brought gravity to the case. This wasn't an abstract property dispute. This was a life. Karen's defense did their best to paint Jonah's condition as manageable, questioning whether or not the immediate loss of insulin truly endangered him. Jonah stuck to the facts. He listed times he'd gone into hypoglycemic shock or near hyperglycemic states. The defense attorney tried to find contradictions, but Jonah's sincerity was unshakable. He may only have been 13, but he'd been living with this disease for years. He knew the stakes. The prosecution then brought in medical experts who testified to the seriousness of insulin-dependent diabetes. They explained in layman's terms why a child can't just skip a dose or wait until morning to get a new prescription. Then Laura had one of the officers who responded that night share his perspective. He recalled the look of panic on my face, the empty vials scattered around the sink, and Karen's admission that she poured them out. That was all on record in his body cam footage, which the jury watched with rapt attention. The defense attorney tried a last-ditch strategy, highlighting Karen's prior charitable work in the community. Apparently, she'd volunteered at a local soup kitchen a few years back, and claiming she'd never shown true malice. They also hinted at mental health struggles, suggesting that Karen might not have been in her right mind. Yet each time Karen's side tried to downplay her actions, the raw reality loomed. She destroyed a life-saving drug, and she did so knowing exactly what it was and why it was needed. The repeated harassing behavior, the intimidation, the note with Jonah's photo, it all painted a grim portrait of a woman obsessed with control. By the fourth day, the defense's arguments began to falter. Witness after witness took the stand. Neighbors recounting episodes of Karen's intrusive policing, a mail carrier describing how Karen once demanded to search all packages headed to my address. The pattern of harassment was unmistakable. Still, none of it guaranteed a conviction. Courts can be unpredictable. Part of me worried the defense might successfully argue that Karen was never explicitly told that pouring out the insulin could kill Jonah, some minute technicality that would let her slip away with a lesser sentence. I kept my fingers crossed that the jurors saw through that sham. Leaving the courthouse each day, Jonah and I felt the weight of everything. Would the justice system do its job, or would we end up with another fiasco? All we could do was trust that the truth was on our side, and pray the jurors recognized the magnitude of Karen's act for what it truly was: attempted murder. The jury deliberated for hours that stretched into days. Each tick of the clock added another layer of tension. Jonah and I tried to carry on with our routines. He went to school, I tried to focus at work, but our thoughts circled back to that stuffy courtroom and the uncertain outcome. Finally, we were summoned back. The jury had reached a verdict. In the hallway outside the courtroom, my stomach twisted into knots. Jonah's hand felt clammy in mine. When the bailiff called us in, I heard my heart pounding in my ears. We filed into our seats, and Karen stood across the room, flanked by her lawyer. Her face was a mask, cold, unreadable. The foreperson rose. After a moment, they announced the verdict: guilty on the charge of attempted murder. I swore I forgot how to breathe for a moment. My eyes darted to Jonah, who had tears streaming down his cheeks. He squeezed my hand so tightly it almost hurt. A sob escaped my throat before I could stifle it. The judge then pronounced that Karen will be taken into custody immediately, pending sentencing. Her lawyer sputtered and requested that Karen remain free on bond until sentencing. But the judge wasn't having it. The evidence was clear. She posed a danger to the community. Karen's face darkened. For the first time, I saw a crack in her stony composure. Her mouth opened, and she let out a strangled cry, insisting that the system was rigged against her. The bailiffs stepped forward, and within seconds, she was led away. After the verdict, the neighborhood seemed to sigh with collective relief. Some of Karen's supporters still grumbled, convinced the system had overreached. But most people recognized that an extreme line had been crossed. The local newspaper published a piece titled, "When HOA Power Goes Too Far." A few community members even approached me to apologize for not stepping in sooner or for dismissing Karen's intrusive behavior as just her personality. They hadn't realized how far she'd go. In the weeks leading up to her sentencing, rumors swirled. People speculated about how many years Karen might face. Attempted murder, especially involving a child's life-saving medication, carried the potential for a hefty sentence. Some said she might get a decade or more. Others guessed the judge would be lenient if a psychological evaluation deemed her mentally ill. I try not to obsess over it. We had the guilty verdict. That was the biggest hurdle. Jonah no longer had to worry about bumping into her on the sidewalk. When sentencing day finally arrived, I sat in the courtroom again, trying not to quake. A part of me was anxious that somehow the judge would go easy on Karen. But as the judge read through the sentencing guidelines, it became clear there would be real consequences. Karen received 12 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 8. It wasn't life, it wasn't a death penalty. Those are rare for attempted murder cases, but it was enough that she wouldn't be able to terrorize our block for a long time. Karen stood, her lips pressed into a thin line. She glared at me, her eyes still full of that unhinged fury. I felt a chill, but this time it was tempered by the knowledge that she was no longer in control. The bailiffs handcuffed her, and I watched as she was escorted out. It was over, or so I thought. It turns out, the emotional damage didn't vanish the moment the gavel fell. Jonah and I spent months dealing with fear, jumpiness whenever the doorbell rang, and a lasting distrust of the HOA. We even considered moving, but Jonah argued we shouldn't let Karen chase us from the place we called home. Ultimately, we stayed. We joined forces with other neighbors to reform the HOA bylaws, adding provisions that limited the president's power and required mental health evaluations if there were repeated complaints. We made sure no one person could ever hold such unchecked authority again. Looking back, I realize how easy it is for a bully to seize power in a suburban community. People want peace, they want their lawns neat, and they want to avoid confrontation. It's a perfect breeding ground for someone like Karen, a person who appears organized and caring on the surface but wields their position like a weapon. Her downfall was that she pushed it too far. If it weren't for that final act, pouring Jonah's insulin down the drain, she might still be terrorizing people over their holiday decorations and the length of their grass. Sometimes I reflect on that turning point, the moment she reached for the vials, determined to clean up whatever mess she imagined in her mind. It's still shocking to me that such a simple, everyday item, insulin, could become the focal point of a crime so serious. It wasn't a gun, it wasn't poison. It was the removal of something vital, as lethal in its own way as pulling the plug on life support. In the end, I suppose I learned that standing up for ourselves is never optional when it comes to protecting our children. Karen tried to push me down a path of fear and submission, but she lost. Jonah's healthy and strong, and the rest of us in the neighborhood have grown closer. We're no longer a cluster of houses living in isolation, abiding by rules out of fear. We're a community now, one that looks out for each other, because we've seen what can happen when no one speaks up. Karen's behind bars, serving time for attempted murder. On quiet mornings, when Jonah's at school and I have a moment to breathe, I sometimes stare out the window at the house she used to occupy. It sits empty now, a silent reminder. But as sobering as it is, I also feel a sense of triumph. We faced something terrible and emerged stronger. And I know that if she could see our neighborhood now, vibrant, neighborly, free, she'd be fuming in her cell. And that's a thought I can live with. The end.